Good morning. I hope you're doing well. If I was to offer you anything right now, anything in the entire world, what would you choose? Maybe it was to have $1 billion or to have a lot of money. Or maybe it was to have a big house or a brand new car that you've always dreamed of. Or maybe to be popular, to have the job you always wanted. Maybe it was to find that special someone that you've always looked for. Or to start the family or have the kids that have the family that you've always wanted. Or maybe for some right now, it's just to get outside and to have life as normal right now. Why do those things appeal to us? Why do those things are things that we want? And I think it's simply because those things we think will bring us happiness in the world. Happiness is, I think, something that all humans search for. We want a way to be fulfilled, to be happy to our life. And especially right now, as we're going through this trial of this pandemic right now, we're looking for how can we be happy when we don't see the friends that we want, we don't see the family that we want. Many of you have come to me and asked, how could we have joy in this world? Can we have this happiness, this desire to keep going on, to keep our spirits up? Several of you have talked about that. And so I thought it'd be good to study the book of Philippians and joy according to the Apostle Paul. 17 times in the book of Philippians does Paul mention the word joy or rejoice. It's all through the book. It's rampant. You can't read the book of Philippians without getting joy. And it's not because Paul was having such a dandy time at that moment. It wasn't because everything was going right in his life, or even the readers, the church of Philippi. Everything was going right for them. Instead, Paul had this joy despite very bad circumstances. Despite being in prison and being persecuted, he still had joy. Maybe we can learn the same. And one of the reasons he had that is because happiness and joy are two different things. Happiness is what happens to us. It's the effects of the circumstances of our life on us. If my wife brings me ice cream, I'm pretty happy. Things in my life are great. But things happen. I get in an accident or something bad happens in my life where I record a sermon and it's deleted. It's happening. Then I'm kind of sad or angry or bummed or frustrated. Not happy. But joy is different. Joy is a mindset. We can't control all the things that happen to us. We can't control our own happiness, but we can control joy. We can control our mindset. And what Paul does in the book of Philippians is he reveals a 4-step program. 4 steps, 4 mindsets you need to have in order to have joy. And today we're going to look at the first one of those. I hope that you're doing well. I hope things are going great in your life and that you're keeping your spiritual life and your physical life both healthy. I can't wait to be with you again. And I hope that we can one day, very soon, be able to worship again and I can speak to you as an actual audience instead of just staring at my laptop. But until then, maybe this message will be good for you and be able to uplift your spirits and be able to give you the joy in your life, no matter the chaos that is going on. So, as we look at the joy according to the Apostle Paul, joy in the book of Philippians, the first step that we're going to look at today is, to have joy, you must be single-minded. To have joy, you must be single-minded. And like I said, this is going to be the first mindset that we need to have in order to have joy. There's 4 different mindsets, and they correspond to the 4 chapters in Philippians. But today we'll look at chapter 1 and how to be single-minded. But as we look at that concept of being single-minded, to be focused, to be devoted on Christ, how do we get there? How do we have that mindset? And I think we need to do 3 things in order to be single-minded in our life. The first is to to look at Paul, to look at what he had and what he looked like and the way that he had himself. I said in verse 20, which I think this is the clearest example of how to be single-minded, how to be devoted to Christ, despite everything that's going on. And maybe the Bible, but especially in Paul's writing. In verse 20, it says, "As it is my eager expectation and hope, I will not be all ashamed, but that with full courage, now as always Christ will be honored in my body, whether by life or by death. For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. If I am to live in the flesh, that means fruitful labor for me. Yet what I choose, I cannot tell. I'm hard-pressed between the two. My desire is to depart and be with Christ, but that's far better. But to remain in the flesh is more necessary on your account." Paul says, no matter what happens in my life, whatever my circumstances, I can be joyful. I can be a service to God because I have a single mindset. If I'm to die and these Roman captors are to take my life, that is good because I get to be with the Lord. But if I stay around and I'm able to survive his imprisonment that he's currently under right now, it's also good because in his life he can serve God and he can help these Philippian brothers with their faith in learning God and how to be with him even more. We see that Paul has certain attributes in his life. And I want to look at 3 of those right now. I want to look at 3 attributes that Paul showed in his life in this first chapter of Philippians that we need to have if we are going to have single-mindedness in our life, if we are going to be absolutely focused on him. And the first is not to be double-minded, which is a very obvious point. I'll grant you that. But the obvious point that people miss a lot. Because people think that if they can do both at the same time, they can serve God and they can also serve themselves. They can serve him and go to church and to sing his praises and also keep the secret sin that they have hidden from everyone else. And yet, what does Paul say? Paul says in verse 27, "Only let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or absent, I may hear that you're standing firm in one spirit, with one mind, striving side by side for the faith of the gospel. It is not finding anything by your opponents. This is a clear sign of their destruction, but of your salvation, that from God." He tells the Philippians, this is how you need to live your life. Let your life be worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that you are standing firm in one spirit with one mind, striving side by side with the faith of the gospel. He's saying that you need to be single-minded. And it's not just the individual that needs to be single-minded and not double-minded, but also the collective. The church needs to be single-minded. So many times I've seen in churches where they split, they think, oh, I'll go this way, I'll go this way. And that's because people are split and they're not thinking about Christ and what is best for him and his church. Instead, they're thinking about their own personal things or how, this person in the church said this to me once, I'm going to hold a grudge about it. They're not thinking of God and his thing. If people did this, if people were single-minded in the church and stood firm in one spirit and with one mind and lived in a manner that was worthy of the gospel of Christ, there would never be a church split, ever. There'd never be a church split. But as I've lived the several years that I have and went to church after church after church, it's rare that you don't hear of a church that hadn't had a split in its background. And it's rare that you don't hear of a church splitting at least at one point. It's because at one point, they weren't single-minded. They were double-minded. And they were looking for their own interests, not the interest of God and for other spiritual growth. And if you remember James talks about this. He talks about a double-minded man. He's unstable in all his ways. A double-minded man is not worth going along. He doesn't know where he's going. He's unstable. He's like a drunk that is too unstable in his head to go straight. he goes this way and he goes that way. And really, these people are also the most miserable, as we've talked about before. When we talked about First John 1, about the descent into apostasy, how people lie to themselves, and on the outward they think everyone thinks they're a great Christian. They may be a deacon, they may be an elder, but they keep hold of sin and they're practicing sin in their life, and they're miserable because they don't have the comforts of God and the spiritual life, and they're also torn and they're double-minded and they're unstable in all their ways, and they're torn because they have all this guilt in them because they know they shouldn't be doing this, but yet they're still doing it. And they're miserable. And they're double-minded. But yet, if you're single-minded, you're not miserable. Because whatever happens, you know what you're going to do. It provides clarity into your life. And that kind of leads into the second point. There's absolute focus on God and his kingdom. Paul wasn't double-minded. He didn't have other things, going into his mind and causing his focus to be doubled and unfocused. Instead, he had one object in his mind. He had to focus on God and his kingdom. And this is totally this is stated by Jesus in Matthew chapter 6. You can't serve God and mammon. You either hate the one or love the other. You hold to one or despise the other. You can't serve both God and mammon. You have to focus on God. You can't serve both. And there needs to be an absolute focus on his kingdom. As we see here through several verses throughout this first chapter about the focus being on the proclamation or the honoring of Christ. In verse 12, he says, I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has served to advance the gospel. In verse 17, the former proclaimed Christ out of selfish ambition, but not sincerity, not thinking to afflict me with my imprisonment. What then? Only that every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed in that church. He's basically said in that last section, people are doing it from selfish ambition, trying to hurt me through it. But as long as Christ is proclaimed, as long as the gospel is advanced, who cares? And then in verse 20, it says, my eager expectation and hope that I will not be ashamed, but with full courage now as always, Christ will be honored in my body, whether life or death. He says in verse 20, he's like, if I'm dead or alive, either way, I want to honor Christ. And then like we just read in verse 27, let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel of Christ. No matter what happens in your life, you know what you should do. Proclaim it, honor it, advance the gospel. Have your manner be such a way in your life that you're honoring him and you're worthy of the gospel. This is how you need to live your life. It's a single mode of focus. It's a single objective in your life. And no matter what happens, you know what you should do, which is relieving and gives you a sense of peace and a sense of joy. Because if your focus is on money and God, then what do you do when someone comes to you that's in really need and says, I need $1,000. I need $1,000. Otherwise, bad things are really going to happen. And you're like, but I really want this money. I had a really nice investment. I want to put this in. No, if your single focus is God, you give him the money. You help a brother out. You do what that needs to be. If your focus is split between work and God, and these two are facing each other and tearing each other, your focus is split. What happens when you have to work late? And then you have to work on Sundays. And they cause you to work Sundays and Sundays and Sundays. Which one are you going to serve? If it's split between the money or the job and God, you may tear with that, and they may wrestle with you, and you don't know what to do because you really want this job, you really like this job, and it's a way to advance in the job. But if you have the single focus, you're focused on God, you know exactly what to do. You tell your boss, I can't do that. I can't work on Sundays. That time is devoted to God. And many times in our life, if you were to make a pie chart, and you were to look at everything that is taken up in your life, and you had a certain amount of time and a part of your life that was devoted to work, and a certain amount of time that was devoted to social life, and a certain amount of time that was devoted to your family, and a certain amount of time that was devoted to extracurricular activities. How much of your pie chart would be God? How much of your pie chart would be spiritually focused? Well, you may say, well, 25%. I feel like 25%, that's more than any of the others. Or maybe you say 51%. That's more than all the others combined. God should be 100%. God is not just a piece of the pie chart, a piece of your life. He is the pie chart. He is your life. And so that you don't confine him just to Sundays or just his pie chart or when you study the Bible. Instead, when you go to work, he's there with you. And your work is his work as well. You're talking to your coworkers, you're implementing, and you're being an example of God in that workplace. When you go to be with your friends, you're again an example of God with your friends. You're saying the right things. You're talking about God. You're saying how much he's blessed you. When you're with your family, you're teaching your kids. He is with you as well. And that his goal and your goal is aligned. You're singularly focused. You're teaching them and raising them to walk in his ways and to know him and have the fear of God in their life. To have faith, to make God your singular focus gives you clarity in your life. And it makes it so that you will never be double-minded. And will give you joy knowing that you're doing the right thing and that you don't have to worry about anything else. You need to have a singular focus on God and his kingdom, just like Paul had. No matter what happened in Paul's life, he knew what he was doing. He was going to preach the gospel. He was going to be with God if he was killed. He didn't care. He had a single focus, and so should we. And then finally, he had a willingness to suffer. You have to be willing to suffer in order to have a singular focus on God. Because there's going to be times in which other things in our life and other forces in our life are going to try to dissuade us from focusing on God, from focusing on Christ and his ways and how he wants us to live. And we need to be willing to suffer. And we need to be willing to suffer physically. Paul talks about this in Acts, or I guess Luke talked about this with Paul in Acts 16 when he went to convert these very same Philippian brethren. When he was in Philippi for the first time trying to convert these people, in verse 20 he said, when they had brought them to the magistrates, this is Paul and Silas, they said, these men are Jews and they are disturbing our city. They advocate customs that are not lawful for us Romans to accept or practice. And the crowd joined in attacking them, and the magistrates tore the garments off of them and gave orders to beat them with rods. And when they had inflicted many blows on them, they threw them into prison, ordering the jailer to keep them safely. Having received this order, he put them in the inner prison and fastened their feet in locks. We see here that he was beaten in order to bring the good news to Paul, to the Philippians. Paul was beaten to bring these good news to the Philippians. And this wasn't just a one-stop kind of thing. This happened everywhere he went. But he was willing to suffer. He was willing to be beaten and to scourged and to be put in prison and to have stocks on his feet because he was doing the one thing that he knew that he needed to do in his life. And you know what he was doing in the very next verse? It says in the very next verse after this, that him and Silas were praying and singing and rejoicing to God that they would suffer for his sake. They had joy because they were doing what they knew they were created to do in the first place. They were fulfilling their purpose in life, and they were willing to suffer because of it. But it's not just physically, it's also emotionally. And we see this also in Philippians chapter 1, and we already covered this, but where some people knew that Paul was in prison, and so they went around proclaiming Christ out of selfish ambition, not because they wanted to save people, but because they wanted to afflict Paul in prison and to hurt him subconsciously. And Paul didn't care. He said he didn't take it personally that these people were trying to hurt him, that they were trying to subject him to emotional damage. And he didn't care because he had a single focus. If Christ is proclaimed, who cares what happens to me? Who cares what happens to me if Christ is proclaimed? And that's the focus that we need to have. And that's the focus that he had all his life. Because when you're a Christian, you're going to have a lot of emotional things happen to you. You're going to suffer emotionally a lot. And maybe this is the most, this is the one that we suffer with the most today, right now, is there's going to be people who you thought were friends that will say, no, I don't want to be part of you. I don't want to be around you. You may have family reject you. You may have friends reject you. You may have a lot of people in life spit on you and reject you. We had, Paul talks about Demas, how Demas has forsaken him and caused him great harm. This was his brother. This is somebody who was with him, one of his right-hand men, and forsaken him and brought him down to, or made him suffer emotionally. And then you talk about in 2 Corinthians 11:28, when he has the anxiety of the churches daily on him, he suffered emotionally all the time. And then you look at how he interacted with the Jews in his home. You look at Romans 9 and how he said, I would gladly take their place if they let me. He was so hurt that these Jews who he loved and that he grew up with had hurt him and tried to reject him in every way. And yet he endured. And yet he endured all the suffering. He didn't turn back. He kept that focus. He kept that focus on God. If I could get to him, if I could have him in my life always, and I have his name proclaimed in all the earth, I am doing my part. This is my part. And so as we look at how to be single-minded, we need to get everything else in our life that may tempt us to take our time and our energy elsewhere. God needs to be the full pie chart. He needs to be every area of our life. There needs to be absolute focus on God's kingdom, and whatever happens, we know what we need to do because God is our focus. And we need to be willing to suffer both physically and emotionally, because things in our life will try to deter us from one way or another. We need to have a focus, not to let suffering, not to let the things in this world get us down, as they often do, but to have a joy. And you know what the outcome of this will be? What was the outcome for Paul in all of this? Look at verse 12 through verse 14. I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me, the imprisonment he's currently going through, and all the persecution, has really served to advance the gospel. So that it's become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to all the rest of my imprisonment, all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. And most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. This is the outcome of being single-minded. Because Paul was single-minded, when he was in prison, he didn't get down. He didn't say, woe is me, Christ, I tried to proclaim you, I've suffered so much, and now you're going to put me in prison. No. He said, okay, I'm in prison. Now what? How can I grow God's kingdom? How can I have him first in my life? Hey, look, these guards are here to guard me. They're a captive audience, literally almost. I will preach to them. And so he converted the imperial guard. And then he said, look, I'm in prison. I'll go and tell other people so that they can have encouragement for them. And people could look at Paul and say, look, that guy really believed in this stuff because he's being imprisoned for it. And it says in verse 14, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. Other people looked at it and they said, if Paul can do that, I can do that. They became confident to go through suffering, to go through persecution, to have a single-mindedness on Christ. And that's what we all need to have. I won't always be happy in my life. That's just not how it works. But that's all right. Because not everything in my life will be great and work out my way. But even though bad things can happen, and will happen too, as long as I glorify God in my life, and I put first Him and His kingdom, I will have joy. Because I will be single-minded, like the Apostle Paul. And it will be the same for you. This is just step one, but it's an important step. Be single-minded, and you will have joy, like the Apostle Paul. Hope you have a good day. Hope everything's well with you.